So we have an awesome session coming up. Open source for good, COVID-19 pandemic responses. This panel is going to discuss what we've learned from other humanitarian crises when it comes to using open source solutions. We're going to delve deeper into each solutions, ComCare, and hear from a group that utilized ComCare to forge open source solutions for African COVID-19 response toolkit. I'm really excited to have Mala Kumar, Clayton Smith, Alexandra, Grigore, Mike Endale, and Linda Raftree joining us for this exciting conversation. Take it away, Mala.
Hi, thanks so much, Dana and Martin. Can everybody hear me okay? Oh, I guess I'll take that as yes. Welcome everyone to the Open Source for Good COVID-19 Pandemic Responses panel. So my name is Mala, and I'm a program manager here at GitHub on our social impact team. I run a program called Open Source for Good. Some of you might be familiar, some of you less so. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the broad remit of Open Source for Good is to essentially make open source work better for humanity. It's a bit of a lofty goal, but the way that we tend to approach that is by working with what we call the social sector. So any organization, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit, international or US domestic facing, we work with those organizations to figure out how we can make open source more accessible, more relatable, and easier to access for appropriate solutions in the social sector. I'm really happy that after a year of research, last month, we published our report, Open Source Software in the Social Sector, which examines the barriers, successes, and opportunities at the intersection of open source and the social sector. You can access the report for free. Don't need to give any information. You can access the report, and you can learn more about the GitHub Social Impact team at socialimpact.github.com. So today I'm going to be the moderator for this panel, and I'm joined by 4 amazing panelists who are going to talk about different aspects of open source, whether it's implementing and deploying an open source solution when it comes to COVID-19, or whether it's thinking about the design and what are some of the considerations and lessons learned that we can take from past humanitarian crises, specifically in public health. I'm joined by 4 fantastic panelists, Linda Raftree, who is the convener of Tech Salon and Merletech, Clayton Smith, who's the Chief Technology Officer over at Demagi, Mike Endale, who's the co-founder of the Africa COVID-19 Response Toolkit, and Alexandra Grigore, who's the Chief Product Officer of Simprints. Welcome to the panelists, and thank you so much for being here today. Now, obviously, COVID-19 has affected pretty much every aspect of our life, and it's personal, it's emotional, and at times it's just flat out overwhelming. We understand that it's social impact, but as a social impact team, it's our job to understand how it's affecting the world. And so through many conversations, thousands of conversations and articles, and from our greater social sector network at the social impact team, we've kind of narrowed down how COVID-19 is relating to the world in 3 basic ways, or in 3 broad categories. The first category is what we call societal. Societal has everything to do with mental health of both individuals and populations. It has to do with the incredibly unfortunate rise in domestic and child abuse that's as a result of shelter-in-place orders worldwide. It also has to do with the also incredibly unfortunate rise in global hunger as unemployment goes up and as supply chains are affecting food aid and food assistance across the world. And then, of course, societal also has to do with distance learning. For the first time ever, hundreds of millions of children across the world who usually have access to traditional classrooms are now learning away from those classrooms. And so at a societal level, we have to think about how we educate our children and our youth in the coming years. Another category is economic. Unemployment in the United States is at one of the all-time highs in the history of our country. We have currently about 30 million cases of unemployment that have been reported. And then worldwide, we're seeing spikes in unemployment, especially in the informal sectors throughout sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. And unemployment also ties in directly to housing. The economic category also includes market volatility, not just stock markets, but consumer markets. And in some extreme cases, such as in certain segments of the tourism industry, even possible collapse. And then the economic category also affects the ever-complex issue of global trade. Now, as you probably guessed from the title of this panel, we are focusing on this last category, pandemic solutions or pandemic responses as a result of COVID-19. Pandemic looks at both the case fatality and mortality rate, case fatality being the number of people who have died of COVID-19 versus the number of people who have been affected. And mortality is often expressed as the number of people who have died of COVID-19 as against a certain number of the population, like 100,000 people in a population. Pandemic also looks at the spread of the coronavirus, both the trajectory of the disease, how it's transmitted, and the number of people an infected person can then go and infect themselves. And then for those of us who are here in New York City or in other epicenters, pandemic responses also have to do with healthcare capacity and personal protective equipment distribution. In the longer term, we're looking at how vaccines are going to be affected for COVID-19. And then in the shorter incremental term, communication and awareness of the disease itself. So when we talk about pandemic responses, we are actually largely talking about this idea of public health, which is not just the healthcare of an individual, but of a population as a whole. So the medical, the psychological, the health systems, the behavior, the communication, and the awareness of a disease and how it impacts a society. Interestingly enough, open source actually has a long history with global public health, and we're proud at GitHub that we play a central role in that. One example is the District Health Information Survey, which is also known as DHIS2, which has been deployed to 67 low and middle income countries, making it the largest health management information system in the world. It's an open source tool that's hosted on GitHub. It's incredibly pervasive across the public health ecosystem. In fact, in my previous life, prior to joining GitHub, when I was at the United Nations, I worked with DHIS2 in Kenya and Burundi. We're very proud to host it on GitHub and to be a part of this global public health ecosystem. So one of the interesting themes that you hear in today's panel is that because we have a long history of open source and global public health, we can actually be adapting and learning lessons from previous humanitarian and public health crises in low and middle income countries and applying that to what's happening here in the United States and in Europe and really worldwide. And so to take you through some of those considerations, I'm happy to pass it on to Linda Raftree, who's going to walk you through some of those from her previous experience. Linda, over to you.
Thanks, Mala. Thanks, everybody, for coming to our session today. I'm glad to be here to tell you a little bit about how we work on technology in the social sector. My work is really making sure that that technology is bringing positive impacts in and making sure it's not bringing in negative impacts or causing harm to vulnerable people. So I'm really kind of like an anthropologist of technology, and that's really where I work. I'm going to talk to you today about 3 questions that we usually ask when we're trying to bring tech in during a crisis. 1, does it solve a real problem? 2, does it link to the wider ecosystem? And 3, what is the potential for harm now and later? So if we go to the first question, does it solve a real problem? Here we want to think about what's the research that we've done. Do we understand the context? Have we talked to other people? Do we know that the people that we are supposed to be, trying to help, are we actually helping them? Do we know what they need, what they want, how they work, what their challenges are? We want to think about whether technology is actually a solution. Sometimes we try to bring technology in, and it's actually not going to solve a problem because the problem is not something that technology can solve. It might be a political problem. It might be a problem with infrastructure. It might be a problem of funding or bias or discrimination. There are all kinds of problems that sometimes technology actually contributes to rather than solving. And then we want to make sure that the tech is appropriate for the place that we're working in. During the crisis in Haiti, we had people that were building iPhone applications for people in Haiti. And we knew that most people who were living in Haiti and really affected by the crisis were using basic Nokia phones. So things people were building were completely irrelevant to the people that they were thinking they were trying to help. The second one is around linking to the wider ecosystem. And here we really want to think about what's already there. If you're working in tech, you know that there's a tech ecosystem that needs to be interoperable that you probably want to feed into. But what about all the other ecosystems that are there? There are data systems, there are health systems, social systems, economic systems that we want to try to build around and build in so that we're not creating parallel systems. We also want to build systems that people already are using, not build them, but add on to systems that people are already using so that there's greater uptake. So you don't want to kind of come in and try to disrupt everything. Everything's already been quite disrupted because you're in a crisis situation. So what you want to do is figure out what do people already know, what are they already comfortable with, and how can you build that and make that work for them better, maybe by adding a small feature or tweaks or something like that. Of course, you want to make sure that what you're doing is legal. That's just kind of across the board. And the last one that I want to talk about is this potential for harm. So, here we want to make sure that we're conducting risk, benefits, harms assessments. A lot of times we conduct risk assessments and think about the risk to ourselves and our company. We also want to be thinking about the risk to the people that we're working with and making sure that it's not the poorest people or the most vulnerable people who are taking on the majority of the risk. We've been hearing a lot about that now with COVID and some of the overreaches in privacy. We want to think about short and long-term impacts as well, and not just fixing things right now, but thinking about what could be the potential impacts of those fixes in the long term. We want to make sure that we've involved users or stakeholders in those risk, benefits, harms assessments to make sure that we're hearing from them about what the potential dangers or risks that they might see are. And we want to make sure that we're setting up data governance systems that can make sure that we're being responsible and that there's transparency and accountability in the way that we're working. So those are just, 3 questions you can ask yourself as you're thinking about engaging in a tech project in a crisis, to make sure that you're kind of learning from what we've done in the past and not causing harm. I'm going to hand over to Clayton now to talk to you about his work.
Great. Thanks so much, Linda. Hi, everybody. My name is Clayton, and I am the CTO over at Demagi. We are a Boston-based social enterprise that builds the ComCare software platform. And I've been working in global health for about 15 years. And this last year, as we've been responding to COVID-19, it's been one of the craziest of my career, but really not for the reasons that I expected. And to explain why, on the next slide, I'm going to tell you guys a story. And that story starts in Silicon Valley, which is a place that in your mind might raise images like vending machines full of Apple products or obnoxious bikes that Googlers use for group meetings. Silicon Valley is the epicenter of technology in the United States. And unfortunately, on the next slide, you can see that earlier this year, it was the epicenter of a different kind. It was the site of one of the first outbreaks of COVID-19 on the US West Coast. On March 10th, 10% of the known coronavirus cases in the US were located in Silicon Valley. Now, fitting to their identity, the Valley was also early in using technology to go on the offensive against COVID-19. On April 15th, Silicon Valley was the first major US city to launch full contact tracing efforts and, in effect, to control the virus in their population. What you might find surprising, though, is that technology that they're using in this fight, it's not magic from Apple or Google, but our software, ComCare, being used to support the efforts of an army of contact tracers who are doing old school epi work coordinated by UCSF. And honestly, I'm still a little bit stunned that the best available tools for San Francisco, whose DPH headquarters is, I think, 2 blocks literally away from Twitter, are the same ones that we use to track newborn health outcomes in rural India. But it makes a lot more sense when you know a different story that I'm going to tell you about on the next slide. I got a news notification on March 4th that Ogun State in Nigeria, they launched their own contact tracing system. How many cases of COVID-19 Nigeria had on March 4th? 1, an imported case that entered the country 2 days earlier. Instrat Global Health Services used ComCare to build that contact tracing system in 24 hours. And the state was already planning on rolling it out to the primary and secondary healthcare systems 48 hours later. This has been really representative of our experience working in low and middle income countries in responding to COVID-19. The government of Sierra Leone, they were recruiting different digital tools for COVID-19 before there was a single case in the country. The most unexpected part of the year for me has been that most of my time hasn't been spent facilitating responses in Africa or Asia, where most of our work takes place, since a lot of those teams are using ComCare or something else on their own autonomously. Instead, most of my time has been spent helping teams in the US understand and adopt that same rapid approach. Now, in the next slide, before explaining the tools these teams are using for contact tracing, it'll be helpful to understand the underlying technology they're built on. So ComCare is an open source, no-code, end-user programming environment that lets organizations build, deploy, and maintain applications that work on browsers or offline on mobile devices without needing programmers. We built this to make high-complexity apps available to organizations who otherwise wouldn't have the resources to deploy or maintain custom software. This approach has made ComCare the largest mHealth app platform in the world. 500 million people are registered for services in a ComCare app. That's just under 7% of the global population. Now, on the next slide, you can see an example of one of these apps. This is a quick diagram that lays out the workflow for a template application that we released in March. And it encodes the data collection, decision support, and long-term tracking from the WHO's contact tracing and monitoring protocol. And everything you see on the screen here was built in ComCare. The menus, the data models, the logic, and the power of that is that organizations are able to import this application template, but then further customize the app for their context, starting with 95% of the problem already solved. And this template only took us about a week to build in ComCare, but it was downloaded by 500 organizations in the first 24 hours after its release. Saving 500 collective weeks of response time is really valuable in an epidemic. Template apps are a really good illustration of how the larger global development community approaches technology. accelerating the reach and speed of deploying tools, but always making sure that we're putting autonomy in the hands of the teams that need it most. So on the last slide here, we never actually designed CommCare specifically to design tools or share them for outbreak response. But back in 2014, Columbia University used CommCare to build and deploy contact tracing tools for Sierra Leone's Ebola outbreak. And they shared an app on our exchange, and it was adopted by teams all across the West Africa region to fight the disease. Once we understood the value of our tools in that context, we eventually took an active role in helping build and deploy templates for every phase of the disease, not just contact tracing, but things like protocols for decommissioning emergency hospitals or providing services for vulnerable children who became orphans due to the deadly outbreak. This is something we're building on much more proactively for COVID-19, and we realized this isn't going to be a 3-month response. We built 7 templates to facilitate health systems responding to different aspects of the impact of coronavirus. In the spirit of our open source roots, we're also excited to help the community to deploy and show their own templates as well. Since succeeding in controlling COVID-19, it's going to take the strengths of every member of the global development community, not just one. And that's something that Mike's going to talk about a little bit more with his work on the Africa COVID-19 response toolkit. So over to you, Mike.
Awesome. Thank you so much to Clayton. And I am Mike Endale, originally from Ethiopia, and I am part of the Africa COVID-19 response toolkit team. So our journey to COVID-19 response starts with a single tweet. This is 2 days after the Ethiopian government announced that they confirmed 2 cases, and a hacker that I am just sent a tweet asking for other hackers to come together and build a set of tools to help. What we found out in the next slide, was about 1,600 people showed up to help. These are doctors, designers, project managers. Everybody jumped in to help, asking how they can help. And the early insight that we had is what Clayton mentioned and what Linda also talked about, which is building on top of existing ecosystem was the single most important thing that anybody can do since we are racing against time. So these groups came together. These are a passionate group of people who came and focused on delivery more than anything. And as a result, we are building a set of 10 products, all of them hosted and open sourced on GitHub. And they provide a turnkey solution to actually run quickly to respond to COVID-19. But our motto is important. At the beginning of this journey, we set a very tactful goal of speed over perfection. This was a single important thing that we did as we are racing against time, and allowing these local civic organizations to be able to respond effectively is the single most important. So in the next slide, we'll show you how we fit everything together. And as you know, no single product is going to solve everything. So whenever that we saw a gap, we jumped in. And one of the 10 products that we're building is addressing those specific cases. So if you have a CommCare or DHIS2, perfect, well and good, you should run with it. And whenever you have gaps in your ecosystem, that's where the toolkit is going to be super helpful to you. The point is, as you can see on the next slide, the point is to provide a purpose-built product that is specific to our learning of COVID-19 tools, and making sure that you have a single turnkey solution that you can use. And the products are beautifully designed. And on the next slide, we have some demos for you, but it's beautifully designed and you will be effective within the organization that you already have. Some of the most important things that we've learned, as anybody can tell you, in responding to any type of disaster is its incremental changes are infinitely more important than any big bang solution. And to that end, I think our products, the project that we're supporting can be run individually or as a whole, and it can be the single most critical aspect of in your COVID-19 response. We understand technology is not the only solution, and Alex is going to talk about some of the important work she's doing. Alex, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alexandra, the CPO co-founder of Simprint, a non-profit company from Cambridge, UK, building tech tools for international development. As we heard from Meg and Clayton, digital tools are critical for global health, and they become exponentially more important in a global pandemic. I will talk about one challenge that many programs that are implementing these tools are facing, and it has to do with the lack of unique patient identifiers. Next slide, please. So the problem is that in many developing countries, there are no robust national ID systems, and service providers can't rely on traditional ID methods like national ID cards or birth certificates, social security numbers, and so on. So the consequence is that ensuring that the right services are being delivered to the right people becomes extremely difficult. So for the past 5 years at Simprints, we have built biometric tools that are helping healthcare workers around the world deliver better services. We integrated these tools with most open source data platforms, like the ones mentioned by Mike and Clayton, to provide unique identifiers based on fingerprint or face recognition in a secure way while maintaining the privacy of the individual. So far, we deployed in 12 countries, working with NGOs and governments across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, enrolling and identifying more than 400,000 patients and improved the delivery of healthcare services. In the next slide, we can see that the need of a reliable ID in crisis response has been recognized by the World Bank as a lesson learned from the Ebola epidemic. Digital IDs based on biometrics, when implemented, have been critical for contact tracing as well as distribution of cash and aid. Basically, without being able to track an individual and the treatments they receive, it's really difficult to contain the spread of the disease as well as allocating resources effectively, especially when those resources are scarce. Next slide. We've been working on a face recognition solution specifically for COVID that can be plugged into the COVID response apps, linking patients with their records through a unique ID that is randomly generated and linked with their biometrics. The raw biometric data is then deleted for security reasons, and the hashed templates is further used for matching. And there are multiple use cases for biometrics in this response. We're now working with various partners to implement this solution, particularly for contact tracing and ensuring continuity of follow-up, as well as preparing ourselves for a future vaccine distribution where accurate identification will be crucial to ensure nobody is missed. And on the right-hand side, you can see a demo of the ComCare contact tracing app that Clayton has shown earlier with the integrated face biometrics to provide this unique patient identifier. And lastly, you might wonder whether this solution is open source as well. Next slide, please. And the answer is not yet. While we started Simprints with this vision in mind, doing open source right is not easy. And I think Mike and Clayton can confirm this. First of all, there are no open source digital ID platforms out there used for healthcare interventions in particular. So there are now good examples for us to learn from. And we are very, very keen to be pioneers in this space, but we need to make sure we're doing it properly. Specifically, as biometrics is a sensitive topic where data protection and privacy are incredibly important, we need to be careful and think, how can we make sure that this solution will not be used for harm? How can we limit the scope of use for global development and keep maintaining the high privacy standards we have in our projects, such as running community sensitization campaigns, using informed consent, adhering to GDPR regulations, particularly as the context that we're working in deal with very vulnerable populations. And lastly, doing open source properly requires significant investment. We need a dedicated team. We need to build a community and maintain it. And finding the right funding as a young nonprofit working in the global health space is challenging. If you have any ideas about how an open source ID platforms could work, specifically in the technology for development space, please get in touch. I'd love to brainstorm and collaborate. Over to you, Mala.
Great. Thanks so much, Alexandra, and thanks so much to all our panelists. I've had the privilege of working in global health across sub-Saharan Africa for quite a while, and I have to say, working with you all has been wonderful, and I've learned so much about how we should approach COVID-19 pandemic responses. I'm sure our audience members, some of you might be a bit overwhelmed with the information, and some of you are probably ready to jump in and get started on helping. So please do take a screenshot of this slide and feel free to reach out to our panelists through Twitter, on GitHub, and on LinkedIn. So in just about 5 minutes, we're going to be moving over to the discussion thread, but I wanted to kick off the Q&A here on our with our panel. And I'll ask the question that I'm sure is burning in every audience member's mind, which is, how do I get involved? Mike and Alex, can you kick us off? What are some ways that our GitHub community can get involved?
Yeah, the best place, and thanks for that question, but the best place to start is our GitHub page. And, you start with the GitHub page, we have a community, and you can grab any one of the projects that we're working on and adapt it and make a change and, create a PR. One of the things that we're really proud of with the Africa COVID-19 response toolkit is it's available individually or it can be used as a whole. And my hope is, and the team's hope is to actually the adoption within the African countries, especially the ones that need it the most, would use it immediately by just forking it directly from our GitHub. That would be the best place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those audience members who are joining in from Africa, get in contact with Mike or get in contact with me, and I'll get you in contact with Mike, because what Mike is designing is really a turnkey solution that can be implemented all throughout the continent. Alex, what are some ways that the GitHub community can get involved with your work over at Simprints?
I think for us, there are two ways. One, we are always looking for volunteers to help us with integrations. There are a lot of open source platforms out there, and we are building integrations with many of them, but there are still some left, particularly some tools that are used for the COVID response. So we are currently working with a range of volunteers that help us with integrations. So if you are an Android developer in particular, we'd love to hear from you, and please get in touch directly with me. And the second one is around open source and brainstorming. If you have any ideas around how do we open source a technology that's as sensitive as ours, again, please get in touch with me, and I'd love to have a conversation.
Awesome. Great. Thanks. So for Clayton and Linda, another question that I know a lot of our audience members want to know is, what are some of the things that are working really well in the open source for good space when it comes to COVID-19 pandemic responses? And what are some things that we should be improving? Clayton?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we mentioned a little bit in the talk, but I think that's working really well is seeing tools that have existing footprints for using that infrastructure. You mentioned DHIS2 a couple times at the talk. I mean, definitely countries where there are existing installations of DHIS2 and they're reusing it and using the modules that they're being distributed from that team, that we're seeing a lot of traction there in terms of teams that are moving really quickly and responding to the virus, immediately, which is what we love to see out of the gate. Unfortunately, something I'm also seeing is a lot of teams who are kind of jumping into COVID-19 response who kind of don't have any history of success at scale and missing just how big the gap is between an MVP and mission critical in this context, especially people who are kind of coming in who don't have that background in public health and don't know how hard that can be. And I think in our discipline, there's a lot of not invented here syndrome. When people jump into digital development for the first time and they think they can build tools that kind of feel more mature to a Western high-tech developer and kind of ignore the last 15, 20 years of lessons that have gone into the field. So I think that's something that we could use a lot more help with, is just coordinating how we can get people involved and upskill them and give them that context.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that I can relate to as a UX designer who's primarily worked for the UN. You can make a really pretty UI. You can make something that's so amazingly appropriate for the United States, and then try to deploy it in sub-Saharan Africa, and you'll get a bunch of blank stares. So I think it's an important lesson learned. So both build off of what's already there and make sure your context appropriate. And on that note, so Linda, you run something called Tech Salon. I've had the privilege of coming to many over the years. Would you like to give us some background on your tech salons and how you're kind of delving more deeply into digital tech and COVID responses?
Yeah, that would be great. So we used to do tech salons in person, face-to-face, sort of small conversations that we had in the same room. We didn't use tech for the tech salon because we wanted a real honest, open conversation that was kind of off the record. But we've since moved to digital. And so we've been running them, on digital platforms and getting a lot more people in the room. And we've been focusing the recent ones really on the tech sector. So the first salon was about, I pulled a lot of the lessons for my talk today from the first salon. We listened to a bunch of folks that had been working in the Ebola crisis, and they kind of brought together their direct experience, their research, what were the tech tools that worked and didn't work in the Ebola crisis. We did one after that around how refugee communities are adapting and using and what they need in terms of technology and what local organizations are facing in terms of tech challenges. Then we did one last week around data privacy and ethics. And the one that's coming up, which is going to feature our host, Mala, here, is going to be around exactly that topic of how can you volunteer your time and your skills during the COVID crisis. So if you jump over, I put it in the discussion, but if you jump over to technologysalon.org, you can find the invitation and you can join us for that salon.
Great. All right. Well, thank you again to all our panelists, and thank you to our audience for tuning in. There is infinite amount of work to be done in the next few years, and I'm so proud that here at GitHub we're taking initiative and we're kicking off some really important initiatives and highlighting the work that's already there. So please stay in contact. Jump over to the discussion thread at github.com, and we will speak to you soon. Thanks.